And may Adath Israel, too, after these 40 years in the College of Hard Knocks and in the School of Experience, look forward glowingly and gloriously to the entrance into the promised land. The promised land for Adath Israel after 40 years lies ahead. And may that promised land, the future of Adath Israel,
speak out for justice and for democracy, because you will learn that truth is stranger than fiction. I felt I had to tell you, or at least those of you who have not as yet been acquainted with our speaker, I must give you a little bit of his background. John Stanley Grauel was born in New England. He was raised in the liberal tradition and eventually aspired to the Protestant ministry. His educational background is that of military academy, university and religious seminary, and is a student of domestic and international affairs. In the midst of his studies, Hitler and evil broke loose. Mr. Grauel's sympathy with the plight of the oppressed in Europe assumed organized force. As a liberal, he has always attempted to translate his ideas into action. He discontinued his pastoral efforts and joined the American Christian Palestine Committee, which he served in several capacities. Still dissatisfied, he joined the Haganah, the Jewish underground army and navy. He became a member of the Palyam, the sea arm of the celebrated Palmach. It was this humanitarian's innate curiosity in people which caused him to study all phases of the troublesome Palestine problem. It was only inevitable that his interest in first-hand sources should prompt him to volunteer as an ordinary seaman aboard a vessel carrying illegal Jewish immigrants into Palestine. The ship was the now famous Exodus. Mr. Grauel subsequently gave eyewitness testimony on this internationally important episode to the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. The report was the deciding factor in the formulation of the United Nations Resolution on Palestine and the eventual establishment of the free and independent state of Israel. When the story of freedom is recorded, one person will not be forgotten. He is John Stanley Grauel.
Thank you very much, Madam President and sort of program chairman, I guess. The protocol up here is very confused. Seema Weissman, it's easy. We're old friends. I came back with her, as a matter of fact, from Israel and her husband on board the Marine Carp in the memorable days of 1947 following the Exodus incident. She had to take off her glasses so I would remember, and, you know, on dates, I thought, well, I better not say too much about that. But the other thing that's always a puzzle to me at these head tables is why rabbis are always put at each end. They sort of function like bookends or something, you know. I once spoke in Peoria, and there were a long table of about 20 people and the rabbi at each end, and I made this remark, and then I went on to say, I hope they're speaking to each other. And I suddenly heard there was confusion in the audience, and I looked around, and both of them were very upset. They hadn't spoken to each other for 15 years. So I had to tell the story about the fellow who was stranded on an island, the Jewish boy, and he built himself a synagogue, and when he was finally rescued, it turned out the captain of the ship was Jewish, and so he showed him the synagogue he built, and he says, I built a second one over there. He said, what do you have a second one for? And you know the old chestnut. He said, well, I wouldn't go into that one for $1 million. Well, some of you, of course, know me, and I don't have to apologize for my particular and peculiar position that I would be standing here tonight to present the case of Israel, or more specifically, to talk about Youth Aliyah, and then, of course, drag in by the heels the book Exodus. In terms of this very kind introduction, it is true that I studied for the ministry. I started out life as a goyish galach, for those of you who speak the mother tongue. I speak Yiddish, but it's with a Harvard accent, so it's with a little bit of a Galiciana undertone, if there's any. And I took 6 months leave of absence to help organize the American Christian Palestine Committee. My 6 months leave of absence has now run into 16 years because Israel has been in a state of crisis every Tuesday and Thursday, and sometimes on other nights when the Arabs take a punch at them or they decide to take a side swipe at the Arabs. Sima and Max will be interested in knowing that I have been considerably elevated over the years, particularly in terms of 1949, and I now bear a most gracious title so far as Israel is concerned. I am known as Rav Aluf Yochanan HaKomea, which is a very beautiful phrase because it means Prince of Princes, John the Priest. They do not distinguish between Catholics and Protestants. A Galach is a Galach, and who needs them anyway? But I think that the best English understanding is that I'm the only man in history who ever started out as a Methodist minister and ended up as a rear admiral in the Jewish Navy. And if you think that's an honor, you're wrong. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the world of Sholem Alechem and the wise men of Chalm and some of the traditional stories, but it is often repeated, at least in the Yiddish, that occasionally when you bring two members of the Jewish community together to settle a problem, you're very apt to end up with three opinions. And so working in the Palyam was not as pleasant as it might sound, even with any sort of an official position, because so far as the Yetziat, the Exodus, was concerned, we had a crew of 42. There were 41 captains and myself. I functioned as sort of a Shabbos goy or a shamus or something, and I can remember very distinctly one day with the police chasing us in France, standing on the bridge of the ship and yelling through the telephone to the aft part of the ship, let go the spring line, and a voice came back and said, mind your own damn business, we'll run our end of the ship and you run yours, which is a little bit confusing. But the years have gone by very rapidly, God only knows, and that's why it made me feel almost unhappy, Seema, to remember. But you were very, very young then. And I look back on them, and somehow or other I feel like a very old man. And though I have worked hard over the years, most people had forgotten the Exodus as a ship. Some people remembered the incident, but only briefly. And then this book came on the scene. And I'm not going to criticize it. I might say that I don't think it'll be added to Dr. Eliot's 5-foot Harvard bookshelf as a modern classic for the next 1,000 years, but whatever cropping criticism I might have in terms of my New England background, I have to pull in my horns in the face of the fact that we have sent out 25 tons of literature every month for 25 years from every organization in the Jewish spectrum and Christian as concerning Israel, and Hadassah sometimes is the greatest offender. I get literature from them by the suitcase load. But I think that this book itself has done more of a job to educate people than all of these tons of literature, not only the Gentile community, but certainly the Jewish community, although there are times when I feel like punching people in the nose when they come up to me and having read the book and say, gee, I can't remember when this happened, where was I? If they are very young, then there's some excuse for them, but some of them look to me as if they must have been around. They just had their heads in the sand, or they just didn't want to be bothered. I know in any terms of fundraising that we had some remarkable sums of money given in this past year purely on the strength of the book from people who had given very little previously, and I'm sure they would have been capable of giving sums of money in a time when we desperately needed them. Well, the book became very popular in the New York area, and one would almost imagine it because there was a community of 10 million people, and in the midst of them is a Jewish community of 2 million. And there was a very peculiar literary device these days, that if you can write a book in which a Jewish boy is in love with a Gentile girl, whether you call it The Enemy Camp or some other horror, it always sells. So therefore, the book hit the bestseller list, but it was pushed out of first place by a book called Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak for a long period of time, which nobody read. The women bought it and left it on the kitchen table to impress their neighbors when they came in to borrow sugar. And the only one I found out who really read it was a rabbi who got stuck with the sisterhood for a book report and had to wade through to the happy conclusion. The other book that almost pushed it out of first place this last summer was something called Lady Chatterley's Lover, which I did not read, but some of my more perspicacious associates told me they had read it, and they said it was not necessary for me to peruse it through to its unhappy ending because it was quite repetitious, whatever the case. I don't know what they're talking about. I say I have some criticism of the book. Chronologically, it is out of order, and then, of course, I think his treatment of characters is a little bit strange. People will come to me and say, who is this person and who is that person? I would remind you that on the frontispiece it says, most of the events in Exodus are a matter of history and public record. Many of the scenes were created around historical incidents for the purpose of fiction. There may be persons alive who took part in events similar to those described in this book. It is possible, therefore, that some of them may be mistaken for characters in this book, which puts me in an awkward position because when people ask me who I am in the book, I have to tell them I'm Kitty Fremont, and that requires all kinds of explaining. I think that it would be reasonably safe to assume that Uris, who treated some matters strangely, that he took as his prototype for Ered Ben Canaan, presumably my Chaver Yossi Hamburger, with some of the stories of Teddy Kollek, Ravane Daphne, Ravane Shaloah thrown in for good measure because it is a composite picture. Obviously, General Malcolm is General Ord Wingate. I don't think that one would mistake that particular situation. I don't know who Sutherland was. I have tried to figure it out. But I think that the classic example was the character of Harriet Saltzman, because obviously this is Henrietta Zold. The woman is called head of Youth Aliyah, which is the only organization that I can recollect is correctly named through the whole book. I don't know what public relations relationship there was with Uris in that particular matter, but he goes on to describe Harriet Saltzman as a tough Tweety type, and at one point he has her light up a cigarette and express an opinion. This dear lady, who, by the way, accomplished everything that she accomplished in her old age, some of you people who feel that you want to quit, look to her. It was the last 20 years of her life only that counted in terms of saving nearly 100,000 lives. She was tough, but she was of tough moral fiber. And so far as her lighting up a cigarette was concerned, she was so puritanical in her approach that she wouldn't even let the girls in the office wear lipstick. Now, I'm not opposed to cigarettes and lipstick. Please don't quote me in that direction. I am a chain smoker, and so far as lipstick is concerned, after all of these unfortunate years, I'm still a bachelor and have some sort of an interest in that particular area. In the final analysis, he kills, that's a long story, I won't try to explain it. In the final analysis, he kills Harriet Saltzman off in the Saknut bombing, when as a matter of fact, we all know that Henrietta Zold wrapped her cloak about her and, to borrow from Bryant, laid down the pleasant dreams after those remarkable years of service and the saving of tens of thousands of lives. Now they are making the book into a motion picture, and we are waiting for it with a great deal of anticipation. It is due to be released Christmas 1960. I wish Preminger had said Hanukkah 1960, but he said Christmas, so good luck to him. They had to cast the parts, and of course we are keenly interested. The main character would be this tough kibbutznik who is capable of any sort of a miracle, Ered Ben Canaan, and so Hollywood, with its usual perspicacity, offered the part to Frank Sinatra. But he had the good grace to turn it down. I understand he's appearing in the picture in some other role. I don't exactly know. If it's Dove Landau, this is too much to take. Landau is supposed to be 17 years old, and Sinatra's been at 17 almost as long as Jack Benny's been 39. But they went a little bit further then, and they decided that perhaps somebody else would be better, and there will now be 3 seconds pause for prayerful sighing on the part of the ladies in the audience, because as you well know, the lead is being played by Paul Newman. Now, I am very glad that they finally got him out of the Deep South. Whether they can prevail upon David Ben-Gurion to play the part of Big Daddy in the picture or not, I'm not quite sure. The other thing is that people will ask me the question, is Paul Newman Jewish? I don't really know, but this seems to be a favorite indoor sport, and we are working on Ingrid Bergman. If you have any information, let us know. They needed somebody to play the part of the Israeli girl, and so again Hollywood violated all of the rules and regulations of central casting, and they picked an Israeli girl. But her name was Cooper. And obviously you can't be an Israeli and have the name of Cooper, and so in the reverse of changing one's name for business reasons, she will be seen in the picture as Miss Aden. But now comes that very, very difficult part of the Gentile girl, and Hollywood again, with its usual peculiar approach, offered the part to Elizabeth Taylor. There's confusion there for those of you who have memory of recent events. Which reminds me, when Elizabeth Taylor embraced Judaism, Rabbi Max Nussbaum violated the laws of Judaism by announcing the fact that she had been converted. But I was more or less grateful that it was announced that she was embracing Reform Judaism, because though I am a preacher, I'm also a man. And for 3 days I wrestled with a mental picture of Elizabeth Taylor in a mikveh, and it was almost too much to take. For the benefit of your stress is on a goy, you know. For the benefit of those who do not speak the mother tongue and who belong to the Concord culture, a mikveh is a heated swimming pool. Well, whatever the case, they have finally reached the point, and so we greet the motion picture with open arms, and I trust that in 1960 it will do as good a job, or in 1961, as the book has been able to do, and I am most grateful to Uris for his contribution to the American literary scene. Now, quite seriously, there are a number of questions which can be raised concerning the book, and they seem to bother people a great deal, and the number one question, for some strange reason, is, were the British that bad? And how are they going to handle this business as they do the motion picture? Well, first of all, I want to point out something, that I'm not anti-British. Some of my best friends are British, and as a matter of fact, the boy's best friend is his mother, and my mother was British, and I was brought up in an Anglo-Saxon tradition. My father was from Germany, Bavaria, but there was only him. There were 8 sisters on my mother's side. He never had a chance to open his mouth. So whatever education I had, it was British to the core. That's why I found some things a little bit difficult to swallow in the several years that we would remember out of our own experiences. But why it should be a matter so strange to people is beyond me. Apparently, those who stand on our side, our allies, their togas must be unspotted before the world. And we are unwilling to accept the fact that we in Western civilization and in the midst of the Allies on this side of the fence occasionally commit our own sins. And yet I have the feeling that we commit greater sins in the sight of God because we claim as our basic ethic in this civilization the Judeo-Christian concept of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, whereas the Nazis and the communists are able to murder people with impunity, but they can do it with a just right simply because their way of life is based upon pagan philosophies. And so I look at the British, and I must suggest that their whole history in the last 100 years or 200 years of colonial empire has been less than something to be admired. One need go back only to India, to a period of time when in the Sepoy Mutiny the Hindus rebelled simply because somebody had reported that in order to strip the strips on the powder cartridge containers, that they were covered with grease, and it was said that this grease was beef fat. Well, this was as much a violation to their religion as to expect an Orthodox Jewish boy to strip the same cartridge and be told that it was soaked in pork fat. But the British bearing the white man's burden, and in the good Kipling approach, decided that the best way to solve the problem was not to straighten out the question of soaking the cartridges, but just bind the Indians across the mouths of cannons and blow them into small chunks of rather popular outdoor sport. And this sort of activity continued on through a period of time, and certainly I know that some of my Chavirim in Israel did not die at the hands of the Arabs, they died at the hands of the British. And when I was in Nicosia the last time, I swear to God, Seema, that the rolls of barbed wire were left over from the Palestine campaign, and also some of the Bebengrads that were in the middle of the street were simply moved across that they might push the Greeks and the Turks around on that unfortunate island. And this past summer again, the British Colonial Secretary, Alan Lennox Boyd, had to step down because by forgery he attempted to justify the murder of 29 blacks in the Asaland and Rhodesia and the wounding of hundreds of others. Forgery itself being somewhat more or less a standard procedure, whether one was trying to destroy Charles Parnell, Roger Casement, or some of the other patriots who objected to English, not British, but English rule. I could be just as angry about my own country, incidentally. I'm discussing Britain. You know, we can't stand up and say we're so marvelous before the world. I look at this West Germany with what happened in Cologne and with the power which is this new Germany, an economic power, and I know it came back this time with the help, generous help of the Americans, as it came into being under Adolf Hitler with the help of the British and the Americans, and it was brought back to power through the policies of John Foster Dulles, who, in a peculiar type of nepotism, his own brother was head of the Central Intelligence Agency, and his sister was head of the German Affairs Desk of the State Department. Now, if that doesn't seem to be a little bit suspicious, one only examines the whole German policy and know that Mr. Dulles himself was legal counsel for the spearhead of the German cartels Farben before the war, after the war, and even during the war in a sense. And if there is a man in the room who will testify to this, when our troops marched into Frankfurt, the plant of Farben had been absolutely untouched by American bombs, although everything had been destroyed in other areas, the excuse being given that it was going to be utilized for general headquarters. And then again, as of this very week, in terms of relationship to Israel, our own Navy Department has finally admitted that it will not give contracts to any company which has ships that have put into an Israeli port because of the Arab boycott. Now, I can go on ad infinitum about this sort of business, but the only suggestion I can make, and I'm not engaging in partisan politics, is that maybe there should be a slight change come next election. I don't exactly advocate one or the other. I just come from Massachusetts, and I believe in a birth control bill for Republicans. I don't think it should apply clear across the line. Somebody's mad at me now. I'll be run out of town, I'm sure of it. The second question which is constantly asked, above and beyond the question of the British, is the question of the children. Is this a true story? The children in the harbor at Cyprus who, after a time, decide to commit suicide, 10 at a time, a minion, religious significance, in order to accomplish their mission. First of all, let us deal with the question of suicide. Why this should bother people is beyond me, because suicide becomes standard operating procedure in the Jewish community and in other communities in certain times. And as we sit in this room tonight, you having partaken of this excellent food with all of the evidences of the American tradition around us, just a few thousand miles from us, Jews are committing suicide, whole families by arrangement, in a place called Romania. Now, if there is somebody in this room from the public press, please do not quote this portion of my speech at all, if you do not mind. Last year, we had so much publicity on Romania that the doors slammed in the faces of the Tzedakah operation, and as a result, 70,000 Jews were trapped, completely stripped of everything, including their Romanian citizenship. Many of them had had $2,600 in bribes paid to save their lives to the Romanian government. And from the Brecha, we have learned, and through our agents, that they are killing themselves off in great numbers. In the meantime, in Poland, we have another portion of a Jewish community which has only singly been eliminating themselves from the scene. And certainly one need only read between the lines of a Life magazine article of a few weeks ago to understand the glorious future for any Jew in the Soviet Union, where 3 million Jews are to be serviced culturally by something like slightly over 30 boys who are yeshiva bochurim now, who will make their contribution to a future rabbinate for that benighted area. I can assure you that some of us believe that somewhere this coming spring, because Khrushchev has said the Jews are an indigestible lump in the body of socialism, and he was able to eliminate a few by shipping them in transports to Azerbaijan last winter where they succumbed, he has also indicated that the point will come when many of these people will be coming out, and it is our belief that when the doors open, at least 250,000 Jews will be making their way to Israel en masse in one group. So when we talk about Youth Aliyah, you can imagine what the responsibility will be just in that area to take care of the children. It could very easily break the back of Israel in an economic sense, which I think is the intent of Mr. Khrushchev anyway, knowing full well that Israel cannot be destroyed in a military sense because she is capable not only of licking one Arab country, but all of them combined, and if I may use a boyish expression, with one hand tied behind her back after her years of building up her strength. And so the story in the harbor at Cyprus is not a true story because it didn't happen in Cyprus. It happened in La Spezia. But suicide is true. We had many ships. This was one of them. It was 1946. The ship was loaded with hundreds of Jews who were trying to get to Adath Israel. The Italians would not let them sail because of the British were at that time in charge of Italy. It was just the conclusion of the war. And so the people went on a hunger strike, and then they decided to commit suicide. Now, one ship. How many of you in this room, quite honestly, remember the ship St. Louis? It's a strange thing, Rabbi. The years go by so fast. The St. Louis came to the shores of our own country, loaded with Jews. 2.5 years they'd wandered around the earth and no door was open to them. The war was on. They came to the United States of America. And in the mouth of our great harbor we had a statue. But they turned out the light on the statue, the torch. They said for the blackout, but we knew why, because even Liberty could not stand in her own light. She was ashamed of it because of our immigration policy. And of course at the base of the statue were some words, but they were loaded words because they were by a Jewess, Emma Lazarus. Give me your tired and your homeless, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. It was a lot of nonsense. They've torn down the statue, by the way. It's no longer there. If you go to Staten Island, you'll see a very large spotted brass statue of Senator Pat McCarran of Nevada. But in the meantime, word went out to the St. Louis that we would not bring them in because we already, as a nation of 150 million people, had the economic burden of caring for over 800 Jews behind wire up in northern New York. And so they didn't report it in the public press too much, but for a number of weeks afterwards on the fun-loving shores of Miami Beach, they picked up the bodies of men, women, and children who had squeezed through the portholes or leaped from the decks of the St. Louis and committed suicide in the sea. And it is rather a strange commentary on the American way that the St. Louis finally found refuge in, of all places, the Dominican Republic of dictator Trujillo. And so the people on the ship then, they would commit suicide, and Professor Harold Lasky of London, who had some Yiddishkeit, but who was a member of the British Labour Party, looked upon the plight of these people in the harbor at La Spezia, and he went back and he made representations to Ernest Bevin. Now, I don't know, I think you won't have as much trouble remembering Mr. Bevin. In Israel, we eat Bevintosh, anything else is old hat, to coin some sort of a pun, so that he will remain in memory so far as at least the Feast of Purim is concerned. But one of the sane actions of his political career, one of the few of them aside from leaving it permanently, was to permit the ship to sail, and so she struck out, although the British were not quite so generous, because they deducted from the allowable number of entry permits the number of people on the ship by previous agreement with the Arabs because of the British White Paper of 1939. Now we come to the Exodus, and if you are confused, so am I. And because they talk about the Exodus, and this ship that is called the Exodus, it wasn't really the Exodus. The Exodus is called the Promised Land in the book, and if you're completely fouled up, it's bound to happen. I'm not going to burden you with the whole painful story of the Exodus, because God only knows it would take me the rest of the night to tell the story. It took us 7 months to complete the operation. We struck out from the shores of this country. We had all sorts of difficulty. We were smashed to pieces by a hurricane. We had to beg, borrow, steal the necessary supplies to keep us moving. We were jailed, we were chased by the police, by the navies of several nations, but finally, having outwitted them all, cleverly, I suppose, I'm not pinning any medals on us as the ability to do much of anything in those days. It was with our hands against the whole world, and nobody stepped in to assist us. We were dogs in the rags and the tatters and the tight belts as we attempted to complete this particular sequence in the Aliyah, the illegal immigration. Suffice it to say that the morning of July the 10th, 1947, we put into Port Said on the southern coast of France and loaded on board this broken-down Baltimore Bay steamer, which ordinarily carried 480 passengers, 4,554 Jews out of the camps. We struck out for the shores of Palestine. It wasn't a pleasure cruise. Some of you have made round-the-world cruises and gone through the Med and found it rather choice as you sit on the deck in the warm Mediterranean sun. But when that sun reaches 100 and some odd degrees, the exodus was not air-conditioned, and then the sea got a little bit rough. The Med can be as miserable as the North Atlantic, and many of our people were seasick, and the food was bad, and dysentery broke out. And then for those of you who can understand the implications of this line, our sanitation pumps broke down, our whole process failed. At the end of 5 days, we were, in a literal sense, and I'm sorry to offend your sensibilities, a stinking shambles. The morning of the 8th day, 23 miles off the coast of Egypt in international waters, in the Stygian blackness of an Egyptian midnight, I shall never forget 30 seconds, which shook the earth, broke the back of the British Empire, created an atmosphere which finally brought into being the birth of the State of Israel. My dear friend Bartley Crum, who died just 2 weeks ago, refers to this particular incident, or referred to it as the Boston Massacre on the birth of the State of Israel. 2:30 o'clock in the morning, I had just gone to my mattress for the first time in about 50 hours. There was considerable work to be done, but the next morning we were going to try to push into the beach at Tel Aviv, and many hundreds and perhaps thousands of members of Haganah had been alerted to receive this tub, this ship. And suddenly the night was rent with the scream of the ship's whistle, and I ran to the flying bridge. I thought one of our children had fallen overboard. We had 1,200 orphans on the Exodus, most of them slated for the Youth Aliyah program, and I thought to myself that if one of the children has gone into the sea, there they will certainly remain, because it would be impossible to rescue them in that darkness. When suddenly the night, which was so black, was split by the great searchlights from 5 destroyers and a cruiser, the Ajax. You remember the Graf Spee? The Ajax of the British Mediterranean Fleet. And the lurid blue lights bathed the ship from stem to stern so that everything stood out in sharp detail. Now, I'd say 30 seconds, in which I stood there, and Rabbonim, I was holding on to the railing, and I had something that I can only call a spiritual experience, and now, after telling this story 1,500 times, I can feel the strength of it coursing through my being. Because I thought I was 1,000 feet tall, and I was looking down upon the scene rather than being a part of it. I suppose a psychiatrist would have some fun with it, but a rabbi or a preacher would understand what I mean. My chest was out, and the tears were coursing down my face. First of all, because whipping from the fore and the aft mast, picked out by the great lights, were 2 Jewish flags nailed there by the young people, standing straight out in the wind and the speed of the ship as she heeled over. And I was as proud of those Jewish flags, the Mogen David, in that night, as I am proud of the Jewish flag now, as I am proud of the flag of our beloved country, the Stars and Stripes. And I don't think that anybody, even James Warburg, of a lunatic fringe in Jewish life, could accuse me of dual nationalism. And certainly I don't believe that anybody could strike out against Seema or some of the rest of them, because I understood what she was saying early tonight simply because of that particular night. The reason why I wept in the final analysis was that standing on the upper deck were a group of over 400 of our Youth Aliyah boys and girls, graduates of the concentration camp, not from any high school, who were waiting to fight the British fleet with its guns with potatoes in their hands. We were struck port and starboard by the destroyers by alternating their screws, their propellers. They moved in, they ripped great gashes in the side of the vessel. I don't know whether you've ever heard 1,200 children and a few hundred hysterical old women all scream at once, but it brings down chunks of God's heaven on top of your head. And then Marines over drawbridges which met the deck of our ship, therefore specially constructed, made their way to the bridge of the ship, hoping to seize it. They did not know that we were operating the ship with an auxiliary wheeled aft 3 decks below, and they could not reach it. They immediately put a bullet through the jaw of the helmsman, a boy by the name of Millman from Boston, and as he fell, William Bernstein attempted to rescue him, and the British, pursuing the broader traditions of Horatio Nelson and Francis Drake and the greatness which is the sea, with 3-foot clubs especially constructed for this type of operation, with lead or steel heads, crushed in Bernstein's skull. The young people became excited. They began to throw things. There was some entanglement with the British Marines. And then in a moment of horror, which I shall never forget, I was standing, our water pipes had failed, and I had a great container of coffee, which was something that kept me going, at least sort of Swedish gasoline, as they say at home. But we had no water, and I was dipping cotton into it and wiping out the eyes of the children, because this is all I could use because of the tear gas. And all of a sudden I heard the chatter of machine guns. And we dropped, and there before my eyes some of the kids rolled over, and it is to the credit of the British that they did not use heavy caliber machine guns, just the kind you use in riots. So the bullets were small and the holes were small, and there was very little blood. But Yukubovich, 15 years old, was just as dead. They hit us 14 times in 3.5 hours. Why we did not sink remains one of the pleasures of God and the miracles of the sea, or vice versa. At the end of 3.25 hours, with 2 others, we made our way over the deck on our stomachs to the radio shack, and by hiding under a heavy table for some protection, discovered our transmitter was working, and as Seaman knows, Palestine was rent asunder by the voice out of the night. The voice from the Exodus, in Hebrew, French, and English, calling upon the world, the United Nations, somebody somewhere to save us. It was heard. United Nations Commission contacted the British High Commissioner, and I use high advisedly, Sir Alan Cunningham. And without going through diplomatic procedure, word went out to the fleet, cease the battle. Our flag was struck. Then began the funeral procession in the Haifa harbor. We arrived after 12 hours. We didn't have any food or water for our kids, and we had a lot of babies, because after all, it was 47. A few children had been born. The camps were slightly closed, and it's hard to tell a small child that you can't even give him a drink of water. He doesn't understand. I remember Rabbonim that Hakamel was touched by the sun. In this Mount Carmel, where the prophet of God called down upon the altar of God fire from heaven to prove the falsity of the priests of Baal, I looked upon it in that afternoon and upon that sunlight, because as the sunlight went, so began Shabbos, Shabbat, the Sabbath. And that evening I went to jail with 3 others. I later got out of it. My story is certainly minor and unimportant. But the people from the ship were loaded into prison ships like animals. And for 52 days they were shuttled back and forth across the Mediterranean. Finally they were taken around Gibraltar to Hamburg, Germany. And there, while music was played to cover up their screams and cries, and I have a photograph which I've kept. If you have an old lady at home and she's a little bit hard to handle and she doesn't want to go someplace and she holds onto the railings in the upstairs room, you can always get her out in a hurry, pull her by the hair of her head. And so they were put into the barbed wire and enmeshed freight cars that took them back to Poppendorf and Baalsen. I don't know if you know the area around Baalsen or not, but when the British relieved it from the Nazis, so many caricatures of humanity were lying around with the broomstick arms and legs that they could not be buried singly, and for sanitation procedure, the British just dug ditches with bulldozers and pushed the bodies in with bulldozers. There was no point in counting them, and certainly they did not have dog tags or any sort of identity marks, because already the stars, the mezuzim, the few crosses had been stripped and added to the gold, which joined the rest of the gold in the chests of Hermann Goering's salt mine treasury in Bavaria. That's why it's hard to understand what the British did, and that's why I want to just for one moment move a little bit to one side to the area which distresses us now. Because there's been a lot of criticism of Rabbi Azariah in Cologne. He started this whole uproar about the swastikas on the synagogue gate, and it's gone around the world, what with the organized neo-fascist groups and with the lunatic fringe and with the crazy juveniles who have been doing it and not knowing why they're doing it. And some of our organizations have said that if Rabbi Azariah had only had a little bit of sense, he would have gone down that first early morning when he saw the swastikas, scrubbed them off, and then there wouldn't have been all this thing come to pass. Well, God loved these experts who have never been through certain situations, because after all, Rabbi Azariah is from Israel. Well, there's just one other minor detail. He spent 6 years at Baalson in the camps. So you see, it's a little bit difficult to be somebody like Rabbi Azariah after all these years in this brave, new, courageous Germany, and come down to your synagogue in the early hours of the morning and see staring you in the face the black swastika of Adolf Hitler's way of life. You don't scrub it out, you scream to the world, because the very ground that you walk on is soaked so deep that it could never be removed with the blood of your kinsmen, and the 6 million who died, and the 2 million Poles, and the million Frenchmen, and the millions of others, because of this horror which was perpetrated on the world. It's to his eternal courage that he struck out, and perhaps at least the leadership today is speaking out, something it did not do in 1939, more than just a casual observance of the Jews are dying, but there's not very much we can do about it. We're hearing even from some of my own fellow churchmen who remained strangely silent in a moment when they should have spoken. The story of Exodus, the story of another day, an ancient story, a story 1,000 years old in my life because so many things have happened since. How would it tie in with tonight? Just simply this, that the rescue goes on, the tens of thousands of children. The dream of a Henrietta Zoll constantly continues. $36 million, a multiple of chai, having been raised through this period of time by Hadassah. But the other day I picked up a paper from Israel, and as I looked at it, I noticed the gun, which I'm familiar with. It's called an Uzi. And this is the mobile gun, which is the backbone of strength in Israel, and it's light enough so a woman can handle it. And the reason why I looked upon it and thought about it a little bit, I'd almost forgotten about it, frankly, was that Uzi, what is this? It's a name. But Uzi was a Youth Aliyah boy. And in terms of the strength of Israel, this one single situation alone, $36 million, if it had been spent just to bring Uzi, then in terms of Sinai and in terms of Israel being able to handle the enemies that's round about, this one lad, this Youth Aliyah boy, did it. I went to Ramat Hadassah Zoll not too long ago and to view the installations there, and somebody said to me, one of the children from the Exodus, or one of the young people from the Exodus, wants to meet you. And as I say, I'm already old. And I thought of a kid walking in. I thought of the kids on the ship, and all of a sudden this grown man walked in, and he shook my hands, and I was a little bit confused. And then he explained to me that he was one of the children from the Exodus. But now he was teaching, one of the Youth Aliyah children, now he was teaching, as was indicated earlier, other Youth Aliyah children in Ramat Hadassah Zoll. I look for that hour. I hope God spares me to the moment when there shall ascend to the presidency in Israel or to the position of prime minister some one of these kids. That certainly will also redeem all of the years. As articulate as I might imagine myself to be, I've never quite been able to express my feeling about Israel without becoming rather maudlin and sentimentally sloppy. But on page 371 of the book Exodus, there is a paragraph, and I'm not going to read it all to you. I merely pass it on to you in terms of the meat of it. You remember Kitty Fremont has gone to Mount Tabor. She doesn't understand the Jews. She doesn't want to be drawn into Israel. She's in love with Ari Ben Canaan. She has the peculiar relationship with Karen, who replaces her own dead daughter. And on this night on Tabor, she looks at these faces around her, and then suddenly a chill passes through her body. An electrifying revelation hit her. This was no army of mortals. These were the ancient Hebrews. These were the faces of Dan and Ruvain and Judah and Ephraim. These were Samsons and Deborahs and Joabs and Sauls. It was the army of Israel. And no force on earth could stop them, for the power of God was within them. Now, this is a cynical age, and only preachers and rabbis talk about the power of God, and so you will sort of forgive me. And if out of your cynicism you argue the great paradox of the many thousands who have died. Yet in 1948, I can remember after a quick mission to Israel, I made a speech in Manhattan Center in New York, and a yeshiva bocher in the tradition came running up to me afterwards, and he said, "Is it true that Avram appeared to the Chaverim, or to the troops, to the boys at Latrun?" Well, it was a poor place for him to appear. He didn't do much of a job because we lost the battle. But this is the kind of a story that grows out of every war. The French argue that in the Franco-Prussian War, in a time of truce, they saw moving between the lines the figure of a dead pope in his white cassock, imparting a message of peace. And the British will argue that at the Battle of Ypres in the First World War, that St. George came out on his white charger to lead the forces, and they're pleasant little stories. But what was I going to tell this yeshiva bocher as I looked into the brightness of his eyes? I didn't see Avram outside of Latrun, believe me. But I look back on those years, and somehow or other I have the feeling that David must have stood at the gates of Tel Aviv with flaming sword. Because I can remember Winston Churchill pleading with my country and saying, "Give us the tools and we'll finish the fight." We didn't have the tools, and they didn't have the tools, but they finished the fight. In Kfar Etzion, that tragic story, in the mutilated bodies in some of the hands which were severed were found the stones with which they had fought the last wave of Arabs. I can think of no better way to sum it up, and forgive me, my Hebrew isn't much better than my Yiddish, I suppose, and I'm not that much of a linguist, but the Rambam commentary on Torah, and there is another interpolation, Kol hamichayem nefesh akat be'Yisrael ki'ilu kiyem olam maleh. He who sustains one soul in Israel, as if he were to sustain the whole world. Thank you for your kind attention.
I'll answer them. It's up to you.
May I have your attention, please?
Going out to see us. Let's see if they're going to settle down.
Mr. Grauel has been very gracious. I don't have to say anything with reference to the story he had to tell you. However, he will be happy to give you a few moments if there are any questions that you would like to ask of him now. If you are all stirred, it looks like you answered all the questions for them. We thank you again.
Oh, never mind. Thank you, John. You allow me to call you John. You have brought back so many memories to all of us, especially to me. Rabbi Haberman will give us now the benediction.
Av Harachamim, O thou Father of mercies, may love and mercy guide us and prevail against the force of hate and cruelty in this world. And may we who are gathered here tonight ever remain united in Maasim Tovim, in good works of brotherliness, so that the prophet's word may be fulfilled. Fiduyei Adonai Yeshuvun, Uva'u Letzion, Berina, Sason V'Simcha Yasigun, Nasu Yagon Vanacha. And the redeemed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing, and sorrow and sighing shall cease as they attain unto joy and gladness. Amen. Yashikov, great talk. Stirring and telling bars.
You haven't changed a bit.
I could testify to the untouched John G. Barker building in Frankfurt. I was stationed there and I worked in the building.
Maybe don't remember.
One testimony.
I listened to all this. The vice president and the president of the
I thought you ought to tell the people here about the film Israel.
Can you tell them that?
Oh.
Hey, you have an announcement.
We have another announcement if you will give us one moment. I don't think you're going to get it. We have an announcement. Too late. Well, she wanted to give it. Oh, no.
That it seemed ridiculous to introduce Rabbi Cohn to his congregation. I too feel that it is ridiculous in view of the fact that each and every one of you are here Friday nights and Saturdays to listen to his sermons, and you know exactly what he has to say. However, I think there is a great deal more than introducing a rabbi who has served this congregation since 1946. There was a great deal said tonight about the sorry days which we passed through. Jaime Stein, who was a member of this, was treasurer of this congregation at a time when he was a business neighbor of ours,